So I am going to talk about this new book, and it does come out October 28th. So I want to start with some nostalgia. I see people out here that remember this time. I most certainly do. These were glorious years, just 3 decades ago. 1991, 89, the collapse of the wall, and then 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. For me personally, and I think for Americans and for people that believed in democracy and capitalism, this was a glorious time, right? The United States was the only superpower in the world. Most people around the world wanted to become democratic. That was something universal back then. Capitalism seemed to be gaining support throughout the world. And even the liberal international order seemed to be working. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, President H.W. Bush rallied the entire world, including the Soviet Union, to say, we're not going to stand for annexation, and we thwarted that. And that was a time, when you think about democracy, markets, and international order, a pretty glorious time. It was for me personally. I was studying at Moscow State University at the time, and if you look really hard, you can see me. I'm right there. Because living in Russia at the time, or the Soviet Union, all these people wanted to be part of the West. All these people wanted to be part of the democratic world. And if you look closely, you can see it's not only Russians there, it's Ukrainians, Estonians, Georgians. It was a pretty glorious time to be an American living in the Soviet Union at the time. Fast forward to our current era, and it's all changed. First, it changed with Russia. And you can just read the quotes there. This book was published in 2009, right? Are we back to a new Cold War with Russia? And then in 2022, it'd be nice if we just had a Cold War. We were then a hot war with Russia, not us directly, thankfully, and that I appreciate that President Biden and President Trump have kept us out of that war in terms of our soldiers. But this is the first major conventional war in Europe since 1945. It's the first major annexation in Europe since World War II. It's the biggest threat to a great power war that I can remember. I think you got to go back to probably 1962 to remember a similar threatening time. And with respect to nuclear weapons, when Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons in the fall of 2022, I think the threat of the use of nuclear weapons was even greater than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So a pretty dangerous time when we talk about the Russians. But it's the same with the Chinese now. In my world, we debate whether we're in a new Cold War or not with China. And you can read those quotes from both Chinese leaders and American leaders. We are in most certainly, most would agree, we are in a new era of great power competition. China, first and foremost, and its sidekick, Russia, versus the United States and the rest of the free world. And so what I want to do today is start with what the hell happened? How did we go from that photo, that's Gorbachev and Reagan, to that photo, that's President Obama and President Putin, and that's in Los Cabos, Mexico. By the way, I was at that meeting, and the meeting was a lot worse than that photo. It was a lot worse. And the same has happened with the Chinese, right? How did we go from this cooperative era, where they seemed like they were joining our system and building capitalism, to a much more confrontational period today? So here's where we're going. Roadmap. I'm a professor, so we have to have roadmaps, right? These are the 4 things we're going to cover today. Causes of great power competition, similar and differences with the Cold War, lessons from the Cold War, and then I'm going to end, if I have time, on a note of optimism. All right, first explanation. You can't get to prescription until you get the diagnostics right. So I'm going to take more time on this first point than the other 3 to try to explain why we are here today compared to where we were 30 years ago. And for me, I think there are 3 main drivers: power, regime type, and leaders. And let me go through those. These are the explanatory variables. Independent variables. Anybody remember that phrase? Independent variables, dependent variables? There will be a quiz, so pay attention. It's not a quack. I'm going to quiz you during the questions. All right, first, power. And I'm going to go through this more later in the talk. But I think this is pretty self-evident that obviously China is more powerful today than they were 30 years ago. Russia is also more powerful today than they were in the 1990s. And relative to China and Russia, the United States is weaker. And just a snapshot, we don't really like U.S. News and World Report around here at Stanford. We like the Wall Street Journal, which just ranked Stanford #1 recently. Yeah, it's a great university, and welcome back. It is a really fantastic place. I feel very privileged. This is my 30th year teaching here. I was a kid here when I came as a 17-year-old kid. This is a fantastic place. Welcome back. I'll break this down in a minute, but nobody would dispute that these are the two of the top three. Russia, maybe fading or not. And that creates conflict. We know that throughout history. Going back thousands of years, great powers tend to compete with each other and sometimes go to war. But I don't think it's the whole explanation, because there are some rising powers in the world that don't frighten me. I'm not worried that Germany is more powerful today than they were in 1945, or Japan, or Poland. Is anybody losing any sleep about Poland becoming a powerful country? I'm not worried about that. And so I think you have to add something to this story. And the second variable here, the second factor, is regime type. And in my world, my academic world, this is more controversial, whether regimes matter or not. My argument in my book and my argument in my scholarship is that they matter. And China, over the last 30 years, has become more autocratic. Russia, tragically, went from an unconsolidated democracy in the 90s to a full-blown dictatorship today under Vladimir Putin. I actually think Putin's Russia today is more autocratic than that late Soviet period under Mikhail Gorbachev. And the United States is in relative democratic decline, and the rest of the world also, over the last 19 years, we've been in a democratic recession. So Putin and Xi, just to remind you, they've become much more autocratic under their leadership. United States, we've been in democratic decline for a while. Note, this graph starts before the first Trump administration. And we got a little bit of good news last year. My prediction, the Freedom House scores, this is from Freedom House, those numbers will go down again after this year. And this is a global trend. This is a global trend. A little bit of an uptick last year. My prediction is when we get the data in for 2025, it'll be back down. Almost a 2 decades long trend of a democratic recession. And yet, at the same time, even when this is going on, when the autocrats are doing better and democracy seems to be eroding, the autocrats are still afraid of democratic movements. And we have to hold those two ideas together at the same time. Democratic breakthroughs scare Putin and Xi Jinping. In Russia, and in that part of the world, it started way back then, Serbia 2000, Georgia 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And these are the threats that scares Putin. It's not NATO expansion. I'll come back to that if you're interested. It's democratic expansion. And I listened to him. I got the chance to hear him talk about these things. This is 2009. He's the prime minister at this point. I'm working for the president at the White House. And Putin went on and on. He does, by the way. He goes on and on. Long speeches. Turns out he gave some long speeches to our current president, and he got pretty agitated by it in Alaska. But I witnessed it. 58 minutes, I think he went on before my guy, the president, spoke. And by the way, I was nervous about it because I was to do the readout to the press, and the meeting was only scheduled for an hour, and I'd never been the senior administration official. I'm thinking, what am I going to tell them? That the President of the United States listened for an hour and then said nothing. The meeting went for 4 hours, so we had lots to talk about. But in this meeting, this is when I heard Putin's paranoia about these democratic movements. And we talked about it, and we went back and forth, and he said we made some big mistakes in Iraq. By the way, President Obama agreed with them. Putin was a little surprised by that because he'd never heard an American say that. Think about it. Before 2009, he'd just been meeting with President Bush. And Obama said, we're not going to do that stuff anymore. We're not going to be sending in the 82nd Airborne to promote regime change. And yet, just a year and a half later, there were these democratic movements, first in the Middle East. This is the Arab Spring. And I want to underscore, I was still working in the government. We had nothing to do with starting an uprising against our ally, Mubarak, in Egypt, nor Tunisia, nor Syria, nor Libya. But in Putin's mind, it was the Americans behind it all. And then, it happened in his country. Same year, right? 2011. Parliamentary election, falsified, 5, 6, 7%. I remember being in the White House talking about it. No big deal. It's a Russian election. That's how they are. No big deal. But this time around, people had cell phones. There was social media. They had more property rights, right? Middle class, creative class is what they call them there. And they said, hey, you don't get to steal our election. One of the slogans, by the way, was no taxation without representation. I don't know if you've ever heard that. You can't take our money and not allow us to be represented. And so it went from 50 to 200, and then 200,000 people on the streets of Moscow. The last time that happened, I already showed you, was 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. And Putin looked at that, and he said, aha, that's the threat from the United States. That's Obama, that's Clinton, and that was me. That's when I became the US ambassador to Russia. Now, we teach here at Stanford, correlation is not causation, okay? I was not sent to Russia to foment revolution against Putin, but you can see this quote from Alexei Navalny. He was the opposition leader at the time, later tragically killed by Putin. By the way, his daughter went to school here at Stanford. She graduated last year. They blamed me for this, and I became the poster child for this threat against Putin because supporting democracy. And when I say poster child, I mean literally poster child. This is a poster they used to have up in the streets of Moscow talking about how I was fomenting revolution with my girls, the opposition. And then Ukraine happened, 2014. This is the revolution of dignity when you're in Ukraine. And when Putin talks about it, it's the CIA-sponsored coup d'etat against his ally, President Yanukovych. And I want to just dwell on this just for 1 minute. Putin is obsessed with freedom, squelching freedom and democracy in Ukraine. It's not about NATO. NATO's never attacked Russia, never attacked the Soviet Union. It's about freedom, and I want to explain why. I was in a meeting with Putin in 2011 with the vice president. We were there actually to get their agreement to use force against Libya in 2011, and we got it. But in the meeting, we started talking about this stuff. And Putin, do you mind playing Putin, Max? Okay, so Max is going to play Putin. I'm going to play, I'm going to play Putin. You're going to play the vice president. I hope that doesn't offend your partisan politics. Okay, all right. So and I'm not going to, I normally would sit and I would do some theatrical stuff. We don't have time for that. We're too smart and too busy. So at one point, he started staring at the vice president. He said, you know what your problem is? You look at us and you see that we have the same color skin. And we look like you. But and then you think that we think like you, but we don't. We're different. We and I. We're not like you. Because Putin, to his people back home, is trying to tell them that we're not part of that liberal, decadent, democratic West. We have a different culture. We're different. We have a different set of, we need a strong hand, right? We need a czarist hand. Call Putin a czar today, he's not offended by that. He's not offended by that. But then he has another argument for why he invaded Ukraine. He says that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. Not a real nation, not an independent country, divided by the Bolsheviks in 1917 and then divided again when the Soviet Union collapsed. But here's the problem. If they're just Russians with accents and they're practicing democracy and free and fair elections and civil society and free markets, that undermines his argument back home that we're different from the West. And that's why he is obsessed with President Zelensky and crushing their democracy. He's an imperialist too, but it's first and foremost about the ideas of freedom, liberty, and democracy that are being practiced in Ukraine that are a threat to the way that he rules Russia today. And I went on too long about that, but it's the same thing for Xi Jinping. These movements threaten his leadership, right? They threaten him. Hong Kong, that's a threat that they can practice more free society, and they're all Chinese. That's a threat to him. Taiwan, that's a threat to him. This is a Hoover group that we're there in 2022. That is a threat to him. It's an ideological threat. It's not just about military power. And then the last cause, and I'll go faster on this, is just leaders. I think leaders matter. in the course of making history. Not everybody agrees with that, but I think in addition to power, in addition to regime type, these three individual leaders also pushed conflict in a certain direction. Most certainly Putin did with his military interventions. A different Russian dictator might have behaved differently. Most certainly Xi Jinping has with his aggressive expansionist activities in these different areas and more. A different Chinese leader with the same power and the same regime might have behaved differently. And most certainly the first Trump administration, when they came in, they framed this in a much more confrontational way. This national security strategy, drafted, by the way, by a colleague of ours here at Hoover, H.R. McMaster. I'm actually not sure the president himself agreed with his own national security strategy. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But most certainly when they wrote this, and we say we're in this great power competition, that moved us in a certain direction that we might not have gone. And right after that, the Biden folks echoed it. They didn't try to change it. So I think it's the combination, power, regimes, and leaders that got us here. So if we're in a Cold War, what are some of the similarities and differences? That's the second point. I'm going to go through this quickly, but because I'm a professor maybe, I don't know, but in this cartoonized debate, are we in a Cold War? I say yes. Are we not in a Cold War? I say yes. And that's the real world, folks, and that's why my book's over 500 pages. I apologize for that. Know that it was 1,200 pages in the first draft, so I've done a lot of editing for you. But I think if we're going to have serious, coherent strategies for dealing with how to defend American nationalists in the world, we have to embrace complexity and not just say it's all black and white. So are there some similarities between US-Russia conflict today and US-Soviet relations? Yes. Two nuclear superpowers, conventional military powers, economic asymmetry, just like there was during the Cold War, and this ideological competition. That's there. But there are also important differences. And if we ignore them, we're going to have bad foreign policies. And I won't go through this whole list, but I want to dig in on the second point on the differences. You know, I can tell this crowd, because the 2020 class is not very well represented here, you remember those maps of the red states and the blue states, right, during the Cold War, and who's on team blue, who's on team red. You know, sometimes they'd flip, right? The Angolans used to be blue, then they became red. Nicaragua, same thing. That was the Cold War. And the ideological struggle was mostly between states. Now, I know there were some communists up there at Berkeley. I know that. That was a joke. But there were, actually. They were. I used to go see them, and I used to interact with them. I was writing my dissertation about the ideological struggle. But they were pretty marginal figures in our society, right? What's different about this ideological struggle with Putin's Russia is it's his form of illiberal nationalism that has advocates and supporters in Europe, in Hungary, in Italy, France, UK, even in Sweden, and even here in the United States of America. So what used to be between states is now a fight, illiberal nationalism versus liberal internationalism, or democracy versus autocracy. I think Viktor Orban is an autocrat, right? And yet, President Trump has more ideological affinity with a guy like Viktor Orban than he does with me in terms of these ideas. That's different. That's more challenging, I would say even more challenging than during the Cold War. With the Chinese, similar mix. There are definitely similarities. There are two superpowers in the world. It is not a multipolar world, in my view. There are different regime types. I already talked about that. That's like the Cold War. There is ideological competition all over the world. That is also true. And tragically, I think this is going to go on for a long, long time. I've been 30 years at Stanford. I hope to be another 30. And my prediction is that I'll still be talking about this great power competition 3 decades from now. I hope I'm wrong, but it feels like this is going to last a long time. But there are differences as well. Some are good news differences, some are bad news differences. So the biggest ones on this list, we are highly intertwined economies. That wasn't true during the Cold War. And I think that creates challenges, as we're seeing now, in terms of the negotiations over rare earth stuff and tariffs. But I also think it creates opportunities if we can manage it well compared to the Cold War. There is an ideological struggle that's real. I write about it in my book, but it is not, in my opinion, as intense as the Cold War ideological struggle was with the Soviets. They're not doing regime takeovers. They're not invading countries. There are not massive movements in support of Xi Jinping thought in Brussels or Washington, to the best of my knowledge. That's different than during the Cold War. But the biggest differences, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, is about us. We're in a period of retrenchment now as a country. That's different than the Cold War. We're in a period of polarization inside our country. That's different than the Cold War. And in my opinion, that makes it harder for us to compete effectively against the Chinese. And then one big thing, last thing. Soviets and the Chinese were split during the Cold War. Today, they are in partnership, and they're mostly in partnership against us. What unites them is their antipathy towards the United States of America. All right, third thing. If we're in a Cold War-like competition, great power competition, can we learn things from the Cold War? And I want to start with mistakes. And then I'll get to successes, then I'm going to talk about new challenges. So mistakes, I used to coach third grade basketball when I was ambassador. The star of the team was my son, by the way. We just moved from Washington, D.C., so it's easy to be the star in Moscow where they don't play much basketball if you played basketball in Maryland. And our whole playbook was pass the ball to Luke and get out of the way. And we went from being, that team we took over was 0 for 8 when we got there, and we won the city championship, all thanks to Luke. Luke, by the way, plays on the practice squad here with the women's team now, and he loves it. But sometimes Luke would make mistakes, right? And if he had 3 fouls in the second quarter and he had to sit on the bench, that was not good for our team. And if we won, we would forget about his mistakes in the second quarter, right? Nobody remembers mistakes. But when you win, you got to remember the mistakes, even when you win. And we're not doing that with respect to the Cold War here in this country. Yes, we won the Cold War. I think Ukrainians and Russians and Estonians and Poles and Hungarians, they were the drivers of it, but we benefited from it, right? But because we think we won, we're forgetting some of these mistakes, and that worries me. Threat misperceptions, you can read the list, I won't go through them. We're doing that again with the Chinese, in my opinion. Overreach, doing too much, we're doing that as well. And supporting good dictators, we're doing that as well. We also did some smart things during the Cold War that we need to keep remembering. We had allies, fantastic asset during the Cold War. 2, American prosperity. Fantastic. That's where we really won, right? When our economy outperformed the Soviets, the West Germans outperformed the East Germans. That very important to our success during the Cold War. 3rd, promoting democracy through USAID, the Freedom for Europe, National Endowment for Democracy. And then 4th, these more soft power things, Peace Corps, Fulbright scholarships, Hollywood Jazz, all part of our prevailing during the last great power competition. Today, I see a bit of a mixed pattern so far. I'm always an optimist, so I'm always playing for the long run. But Trump's doing some things right. We have a stronger economy than many others, although whether that's because of his policies or in spite of them, that's a big debate that I'm not qualified to talk about. But I worry about the long term for some of the reasons. And we are, tragically, but necessarily, still spending a lot on our military. We have to do that. But he's also making some mistakes, in my opinion. And the biggest one I'm worried about is the top. Allies were our great superpower during the Cold War, and he is antagonizing our allies for no good reason. Why are we talking about invading Greenland? How stupid is that? They are our ally. We don't need to invade Greenland. They'll let us have our bases there. They'll let us mine there. We need our allies. And I would remind you, when people say our allies don't do anything for us, that means you haven't studied our history. Because we were attacked on September 11th, 2001. And the only time that Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, was invoked was for our defense. And soldiers from our NATO allies died in Afghanistan with us, Please do never, I don't never want to hear another time that our allies are not there with us, and we need them for this long-term fight, especially with the Chinese, but also Russia. Second, the erosion of global capitalism. I just don't understand the tariff stuff. I think it's illogical. Yes, we needed reform from trade. Yes, the WTO is not working well, but reform it, don't blow it up. And then third, the soft power retreat. Trump just shut down USAID. Just shut it right down. It was created by President Kennedy in 1961, the height of the Cold War, so that we could compete with the Soviets around the world, around the developing world. And he just shut it down. Guess what? The Chinese aren't shutting down their economic assistance programs. They're expanding them. Like, same with our international radios. Voice of America, you just shut it down. Chinese aren't shutting down theirs. National Endowment for Democracy, it's barely surviving. They're not shutting down theirs, neither are the Russians. And I just think this is a retreat. It's a self-wound that we've got to get back into using these instruments of influence, or we are going to lose, especially when competing with the Chinese. And then finally, on the soft power thing, you cannot promote democratic ideas abroad if you don't practice democracy at home. And we got a lot of work to do on that front as well. And then these are more for the future. I'm more optimistic than others, but these are some of the things I worry about for the long term, especially this McCarthyism, this anti-immigrant thing. Again, one of our great strengths during the Cold War was, A, we invested research and development in places like Stanford to become some of the greatest universities in the world, and then, because of our model and our universities and our economic opportunity, we attracted some of the best and brightest people in the world. And I've been teaching them here at Stanford for 30 years. And now we're threatening to undermine that. That's just not rational. It doesn't make sense because the Chinese are not doing that. We have got to get back to those successes from the Cold War. Overreach, I'm less worried about this than I used to be. Embracing good dictators, I just want to remind you, we didn't have to ally with apartheid South Africa to prevail in the Cold War. And we didn't have to ally with all kinds of creepy crawler dictators around the world during the Cold War. And just because you're anti-Chinese doesn't mean you're pro-democracy and pro-freedom. And I just worry sometimes that we're slipping into those patterns again like we did during the Cold War. And you see already in just the last year that on this soft power stuff, we're beginning to lose this battle around the world. And then there are two more things that worry me that have nothing to do with the Cold War. One, isolationism. Two, polarization. Isolationism started in the first Trump administration, where he started to withdraw from cooperation, international stuff, and he's continued that in his second term. But I want to be clear, this is not a Trump idea, and this is not a Democrat versus Republican idea. There are deep isolationist tendencies in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That makes me nervous. And when it comes to promoting democracy, you can see where it ranks there, pretty slow. A lot of Americans are not with me in the idea that we should be promoting ideas abroad. Second, polarization. I don't think this is equal. I think one party and one set of actors are more polarizing than the others, but it is on both sides, and this hurts us when we try to compete abroad. If we're fighting among ourselves at home, we are not able to compete with our adversaries abroad. And in many ways, and just so we're clear, this is not a partisan thing. This is Condoleezza Rice, right on this podium, by the way, talking about these things, where the center has disappeared. It's disappeared on a lot of things, but for what I work on, on foreign policy, I think it's really threatening. And sometimes I worry that the greatest threat to our prosperity and our ideas and our security is not China and Russia, but ourselves. This is new. This is not like the Cold War. Yes, the 60s were a polarizing time. Yes, we had troubles and, Nixon resigned. But I think this is greater, and if we're not together, we're going to struggle in the world. But I promise you, I'm going to end on a good note. Oh, good. I got 5 minutes. That's all I need. And then we'll take your questions. Reasons for hope. I still think, when you add it all up, Small d Democrats, of which I consider myself, and I hope most Americans still consider themselves small d Democrats, believing in democracy. I think we, in the aggregate, are better off and better prepared for this 21st century competition with autocracy compared to our adversaries. So let me go through this quickly. Military power, we're still one of the only nuclear powers in the world. It's just us and Russia. China's catching up, but we're way ahead. And when it gets to conventional power, when you add up our allies, if they are our allies, right? That's why allies are so important. Look at the blue versus the red. We got a lot more conventional power than the Chinese and the Russians. And allies, I just mentioned this, the Chinese and the Russians have each other, although it's a kind of complicated relationship. I write about that in my book. But we have a great superiority when it comes to allies, as long as we can keep them. Second, economic power. Yes, the Chinese are catching up. That is true. And if it's PPP, then they've already surpassed us. That is true. That is a remarkable achievement that the Chinese Communist Party has done over the last 4 decades. They did it, by the way, not by being communists. They did it by introducing market reforms. I think that gets messed up in our debate and when we talk about the Chinese. But they're coming. But we're still ahead. We're still ahead. We're way ahead of the Russians, of course. And when you add up the whole world again, democracies versus autocracies, 9 of the 10 of the largest economies in the world are democracies. Most of them are our allies. I think we're still in pretty good shape there. Likewise, GDP per capita, we're way ahead of the Chinese and the Russians. My prediction, and I'm going to make it now, and I'm going to take any bet that in 100 years, China still will not catch up with us, and you can claim your money in 100 years. But we're way ahead on this. Our society is way ahead. And by the way, if you look at the top 20 countries, GDP per capita, richest countries in the world, 19 of them are democracies. Singapore is the only one on that list. We're way ahead on this one as well. Third, because we're at Stanford, we should remind ourselves of this great superpower we have, which are the best universities in the world. The Chinese have few, they have a few, and they are investing in them, unlike us right now. But we're still way ahead here, especially with our allies. Companies, we're still, the most valuable companies in the world are still predominantly in the West, and most of them are in the United States, and a lot of them are right here in the Valley. And then I hinted at this about China, and this is what I worry about in this overestimating the threat. China grew because they abandoned statism, because they introduced market reforms, because they allowed for entrepreneurship. That's why they grew the way they did. And when I hear the communists are better at economic growth, I want to remind you, there was this guy Mao. Study economics under Mao. He was also a communist, leading the Communist Party. It wasn't the Communist Party that grew. It was the policy choices, starting with Deng Xiaoping, that grew that economy. And today, I see some real constraints on the future growth of China. One, Xi Jinping is becoming more status, more state control. I think that will be bad for long-term growth. Second, it's really hard to go from middle income to high income. That's called the middle income trap. They're in it right now. 3, inequality in China is rising, and inequality is bad for long-term economic growth. By the way, it's bad for us too. We need to focus more on it here at home, but I think it's going to be hard for them. And then 4th, they have got real demographic challenges that I think will slow down their economic growth over time. 3rd, ideational power. I agree with this conservative guy. You can read it there, right? Basically, democracy, man, it is a horrible system of government, except for all those others tried. I think Churchill was right. And guess what? Most people in the world agree with Churchill. They don't want the Communist Party choosing who should lead them. They don't want a god, as they allege in Iran, choosing who should lead them in theocracies. They don't want a colonel. And they don't want a guy like Putin choosing who should rule their countries. And here, this is one of our greatest strengths. Our ideas about liberty, freedom, and democracy are better than their ideas about dictatorship, and most of the world agrees with us, which is why we can't abandon our support for these ideas. And let's say you don't care about ethical and moral things, right? Let's say you just care about power and security. Well, even if that's all you care about, you should care about seeing more democracy in the world. Think about it for a minute. This is part of the test. Any Canadians here? Good, because otherwise I get in trouble about the War of 1812. Oh, there is. Okay, don't raise your hand. I know I'm on thin ice here, but almost all of our enemies over the last 250 years have been dictatorships. Not all of them. We can debate some of them and how you code the War of 1812. Very complicated. I used to teach a class about democracy and development with a professor from Canada, and she would always hammer me on that. But we'll come back to that during questions. Second, when countries that used to be dictatorships become democracies, they become our allies. And here's the obvious list. Germany, Japan, Italy, they're our allies after the regime change. And even Yeltsin's Russia in the 1990s was closer to us than they are today. That's a good thing. Prosperity follows from that. We invest more and trade more with democracies. And as I've already talked about, the rise of autocracies have made us less safe. So I think there's a moral reason why we should support democracy, but I also think there's this security reason. And that's why I agree with this small d Democrat, one of the heroes of mine, where she talks about why it's not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. All right, last point I want to make. Political scientists are not good at predicting the future. We don't know how to do it. So don't ask me what happens in Russia after Putin dies. I don't know. And don't believe anybody who says they do know. By the way, I worked 5 years in the US government. The CIA is not very good at it either. They missed the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, Arab Spring in 2011, mobilization in Russia in 2011, and the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2013-14. And there's a good reason for it. It's just hard to predict these things. So I want to be modest in predicting a better long-term future for America and small d Democrats. But I just remind you, we've been through bad times before. We've had these lapses. 1930s, a lot worse than it is today. And we got out of that. Look at how red the world became in 1939. There were like 12 democracies left. Very dangerous time. We're not that far gone. Some people here I can see, you'll remember the 70s when it felt like the whole world was becoming communist, right? Southeast Asia, they all became communist. Angola, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and then Nicaragua. And it felt like the correlation of forces, that was a Soviet word. The communists were all taking over, these communists. One of them still in power, by the way, that's Ortega. And that turned out to be wrong. 15 years later, it got pretty red again, right? 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. So I'm not sure that we're going to repeat that. But if I think over the long term, I'm betting on democracy over autocracy. Over hundreds of years, the arrow, I think, points this way. We're in a squiggly time right now, right? I already showed you the date on that. But when we think about it over the long term, I think history, if you're a small d Democrat, is on our side. And so maybe predictions about America's decline and decline of democracy around the world are premature. I put a question mark there. I don't know it, but I'm optimistic because of the data I just showed you about power, economics, and ideology, and these other trends we've had over the last 100 years. So I think it's too early to bet against America yet. And I also think it's too early to bet against small d Democrats. And here's why. Because I've met some of these people. This guy, he was at Stanford in 2021, folks. He's meeting with the president right now while we're here. I'm not betting against Zelensky. Are you betting against Zelensky? I'm not betting against him. I'm not betting against Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. She's the leader of the opposition living in exile in Belarus. I've met her here. We've had her here at Stanford. I'm not betting against her. And all of these small d Democrats that we've had the honor and privilege to host over at FSI, all of these people are fighting for democracy all over the world, some of them in very difficult places. There is nothing more inspirational than meeting these kind of people. I want to be on their side, not on the other side. Thanks, I'm done. Thank you. Good. Thank you. And I did it all, as promised, in under 40 minutes, so we have some time for questions. So those with the microphones, I'll just let you choose who you want. I can't see that well. This is my 40th reunion. So you just choose them, okay? And I'll just answer as many questions as I can. Yeah, go ahead, Judy. Yeah, for sure. And there, if you want to pre-order, you can pre-order as well. Yeah,
Hi.
get your phones out right now. I'm just kidding.
My name is Lori, and I'm married to a Stanford Law graduate, but I'm here for his reunion. I'm curious to know your opinion as to whether the BRICS expansion is a threat.
Yes. So BRICS is this weird acronym that came from a bank in New York, by the way. It didn't come from China, but it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. That's the original BRICS. That's where that acronym comes from. And the Chinese especially, but the Russians, they have organized, and now they've expanded it beyond that original 5. And in my mind, they're doing exactly what we should be doing. So what they're doing, especially Beijing, especially Xi Jinping, Putin wants to break up the international order. He wants to destroy everything and go back to the 19th or 18th century, right? But the Chinese have a more sophisticated strategy. They want to keep a foot in the existing multilateral institutions. So like United Nations, we're like walking away. They're not walking away. They want to keep their footprint there and keep their influence there. I think it's a big mistake for us to walk away from the United Nations. They're not doing it. But in parallel, and BRICS is one of them, but there are many others, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, AIB, BRI, and they have regional ones as well. They're creating new clubs, mostly based on economics, that China is at the center of, and we're not there. The United States, we're not a member of BRICS. And I think it's an extremely effective strategy. It's what we did at the end of World War II, where people talk about the liberal international order. It actually wasn't international after 45. When we created the Bretton Woods system with the World Bank and the IMF and GATT and later the World Trade Organization, it actually united the capitalist world, the free world, together. The Soviets weren't a member of those clubs. And we're not doing that right now. We are not offering an alternative, and I think it's a big strategic mistake. You can't beat nothing. You can't beat something with nothing. And we're not offering, especially in Africa, especially in Latin America, especially in Southeast Asia and the Middle East, we're not offering an alternative structure, and I think it's a big mistake, and I hope we correct for it. Over here, or
He can't hear you, sir. 1 sec, okay?
get you a microphone.
Hi.
We'll get to you next. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I think a big reason we're in the predicament we're in is we did not know how to handle things in the 90s when we had so much opportunity in Russia and so forth. We just said, oh, people are going to be democratic. We don't have to worry about it.
Yes.
So is there going to be opportunities for us to have that same kind of opportunity? We'll be smarter about taking advantage of them.
Well, that's a great question, and I write about that in my book. Sorry to keep advertising. But I talk about, I have a whole section of the book called Losing the Peace, right? I think that's what you're alluding to. And we did. We need to acknowledge our mistakes. And let me explain it so that we don't do it again. So the Soviet Union collapsed, and it seemed like the whole world wanted to become democratic. My colleague, Frank Fukuyama, colleague here at Stanford and FSI, wrote this fantastic essay called The End of History, because it seemed like we're all going to become liberal democracies. And then we checked out. And because, in my view, there was not a threat to the east of Russia, like there was after the end of World War II. We didn't do the Marshall Plan just out of the goodness of our hearts. We did it because we were afraid of the Soviets. And we decided we had to rebuild those societies to help us contain the Soviets. But if China were as powerful back then as they are today, we might have done that, right? But they weren't. They were weaker. They were much weaker. And so we just thought, well, it's all going to happen inevitably. We don't have to do anything about it. And then we had an election in this country, and there was this kind of marginal, I shouldn't call them that. I realize I'm being taped. There was this very, and I'm a big admirer of him now. There was this, no adjectives. There was a governor from Arkansas. I'm going to leave it at that. And he came out of nowhere. this is I just told you, right? Like H.W. Bush at the beginning of 92 had like a 90% approval rating, right? Because of what we had just done in Kuwait. And he came along. This guy knew nothing about the world. That's not fair either. He knew something, but he was new to this. And he said to the American people, because I'm saying this on purpose because it echoes a little bit of our moment today. He said, why are we spending all this money and all this time abroad? We got our problems here at home. And you remember what his number one campaign slogan was, it's the economy, stupid, right? That's what he said. And because of that, we pulled back. We did not go all in to help the Russians make that transition in 1992. And by the time President Clinton became president, he understood that we needed to, but it was too late. They'd already missed their opportunity. So if we ever get a chance to do that again, if there's ever a democratic breakthrough in some of these countries I'm talking about, we have to learn that a lesson and not repeat it again. Whoever has a microphone.
Thank you.
Oh, right there. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I saw the Ho Chi Minh slide there, and he was considered a communist dictator. And then I think of what happened upon his arrival into South Vietnam at the time, and what he then seemed to have, what he or the movement he was part of brought about a great democracy in Vietnam of sorts, I think, now. So what does Ho Chi Minh evolve into a force for good? I mean, his movement?
Well, Vietnam is not a democracy, in my opinion, and those that study it. It's a dictatorship today. It's a one-party, Communist Party dictatorship. But I would say two things about that. That was a moment when we conflated nationalism and communism. We did not need to fight the war in Vietnam to prevail against the Soviets. We know that because we did. And so we got to avoid that. And where I see that sometimes is when we conflate Chinese economic engagement in the developing world with the export of communism. And I just think it's a more nuanced story than that. I have a whole chapter to try to be nuanced about it rather than be black and white about it. That I worry about. We're going to think that we have to contain the Chinese all over the world because they're exporting communism. And I see it differently. I think they are supporting autocracy, and I talk about that in detail in the book. But I don't think they're trying to overthrow the world capitalist system like the Soviets were, in part because they need the world capitalist system for their economic growth. So I think we need to be careful about that. With respect to Vietnam, I think we also need to be careful about pretending, in my view, that they're now on a path of political liberalization because they're anti-Chinese. Watch, that's the way our government speaks about Vietnam now. And I don't think there's data to support that hypothesis that they're somehow reforming, but because they're anti-Chinese, suddenly they become our allies. And I just want to be clear about this, because it's hard to talk about clearly. We need autocratic friends and allies. We need to engage with autocracies and autocratic leaders to defend our national interests. We need to do that. We did it in the Cold War. We need to do that from time to time. But because I'm speaking here at the Hoover Institution, I remember one of my mentors here was a guy named George Shultz, who worked for Ronald Reagan, a fantastic Secretary of State. Leave your partisan politics aside and forget, like I didn't vote for Reagan twice. I protested against, there's photos of me in the Stanford Daily protesting against our investments in South Africa up on the lawn of the president's house. I now live next to him, but I'm out there screaming and hollering. I was not a fan. I want to be honest. I'm not going to do revisionist history. I was not a fan of what Ronald Reagan was doing, especially in South Africa at the time. But Shultz, in his memoirs, which is, I think, the best memoir written about diplomacy ever, the tragedy of that book is that it's 1,100 pages long, and that means nobody reads it, but I've read it, and in chapter 27, or maybe it's 29, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure it's 27, he has a chapter called Re-engaging the Soviets. And he didn't, this is before Gorbachev, this is 1982, right? He comes in after Reagan had been in power for a couple years, and he saw that there was no interaction with the Soviets, and he said, this is crazy. We got business to do with these folks, even if back then the president called them the evil empire, that's what he called them. By the way, that's when I went to study in the Soviet Union in 1983. Imagine my mother in Montana when I called her to say, hey, Mom, I've never been abroad before. I'd never been abroad. I'm not going to Florence. I'm not going to Oxford. I'm not going to Paris. I'm going to Leningrad. And you got to remember, my mom didn't want me to come to California. California was a communist state for her at the time. And so, my God, he went to Stanford and became a communist. I didn't, but that was what she thought. But just remember that era, right? And yet, even in that era, Schultz writes in his memoirs, we got to talk to them. And back, it was about nuclear weapons. But he said one really important thing that I wish the president would read his book, or Secretary Rubio. When we meet with the Soviets, we're not going to check our values at the door. We're not going to pretend we're friends. You can do diplomacy without pretending that you're friends. And I think that's a really important lesson for how we deal with China and Russia today.
Can you keep your questions?
Great, I will. Very briefly, fantastic talk.
Thank you
So much. I wonder what you're thinking about.
The book's even more fantastic. No,
I'm sure it is. And I'm sure this is in one of the other 500 pages, but the economic competition between the US and China.
Yes.
So I think it's sort of history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes situation.
Yes.
Absolutely true. Cold War is about regime change and political influence, but it seems to me that the way to think about the world today is economic influence.
Yes.
China building roads in Africa, all over Latin America, et cetera. And then the asymmetry between US's dependence on Chinese technology, but not the reverse.
Yes.
I say that as a software engineer for 35 years.
Yep.
So love your thoughts on that.
It's a great, big, hard set of questions. And because my book's already long, somebody needs to write the definitive account for how that happened, what you just described. How is it that we became so dependent on all the things that we are? That just seems like that was a major strategic mistake that Democrats and Republicans share over decades. And so we need to study that and make sure it doesn't happen again. Second, we need to compete with the Chinese around the world. You can't, they have the Belt and Road Initiative where they're doing exactly the same things you just described. And I talk to ambassadors all over the world all the time, and they're like, we're not offering anything. We're not offering trade, because we don't believe in trade anymore. We're not offering economic development. And the ambassadors, especially like in Southeast Asia and Africa, we've got nothing. And so we've got to get back to the idea that we have to be in that. And then third, it's become kind of popular. There's a new notion that we got to become more like the Chinese to compete with the Chinese. I disagree with that. That's their model. That's not our model. But we do have to improve our economic system. And what I say in the book is we do need to do certain coercive things to control certain technologies flowing to China. I believe that. And I think the Biden administration, I think they made a lot of mistakes, but I think that was one of the things they got right. And I worry that the Trump administration is undermining some of those export controls. But that's just one element. We can't just win this race by trying to trip the Chinese. We've got to run faster. We've got to be better. And for me, there are two necessary conditions for that. More investment in research and development, not less, and attracting the best people around the world, not telling them you can't come, or if you come, you have to pay $100,000 to get a visa. That is a recipe for losing to the Chinese.
We have time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions, so they better be good ones. No, just kidding.
So thank you. That was amazing. And these are all very large overhead ideas. Do you have any recommendations on what the individual can do to help push towards democracy?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. Be engaged. So you're doing it right now. Thank you for being here. I think this is a time when there are challenges to our democratic institutions. The piece of paper, the Constitution, is just that. It won't be anything unless people fight for its preservation. And did you just notice that? That's a very conservative idea, right? To conserve what we have So I'm trying very hard to not be partisan about it. I think that's a conservative idea, not a radical idea. The other thing, to tear it down, that's the radical, that's the revolutionary idea. But I would say, do it in a way that you don't cartoonize and make assumptions about those that you think are your enemy. This polarization in this country, it's just killing me. You know, I'm from Montana. Yeah, we got some Montanans here. You guys might know, but so I worked for Barack Obama. I worked on his campaign very proudly. And whatever your politics are, it was a great honor to serve with him. And by the way, it was a great honor to represent, if you're an American, our country abroad. It was the greatest honor of my lifetime to be the U.S. ambassador in Russia. Back in 2008, guess what percentage of vote Barack Obama got in Montana? Guess. 20? 28. 47%. 47%. Senator McCain got 49%. And we don't have many African Americans in Montana, right, folks? He's a super competitive guy, just so you know. I've played basketball with him. I was on his team when we lost 3 times in a row, and I thought he was going to fire me from the National Security Council because I wasn't playing defense good enough. But I just tell you that because that wasn't 100 years ago. That was just a few electoral cycles ago. We're way more purple than we are red and blue when you just sit down and talk to people. I got relatives that voted for Trump twice. I just was at a wedding with them. We all were dancing to the same country music together. I just think our elites are polarized, our media is polarized, our big donors are polarized, but I don't think the American people are as polarized as the rest. And so on an individual basis, just try to talk to somebody that may have a different set of views from you. And I'm gonna back that up, my words, with action. So I'm here today. I'm very honored to be here today with you all. But I was in San Antonio, Texas. I gave a talk there just 2 weeks ago. Thank you if you're from San Antonio, a great city. I was at Trinity University. I was at UT Arlington last week speaking to a crowd like this. And after the book launch, I'm going to go to Pennsylvania, Ohio, Idaho, etc., because I want to engage with people that may not just agree with me. And I think that's part of it. So defend our democracy. Small d defense. This is not about what you think the tax rate should be or healthcare. Those are debates we have in an ideological perspective. We should not have a fight over democracy. We should all believe in the democratic institutions, democratic rules of the game, and then fight over the other things when the rules are established. But then also make an effort to you don't have to agree with people that have a different perspective, but at least talk to them. And I find when I do that, I learn a lot. All right, that was a great question, by the way, so last question now.
Short last question, please.
All right, I'll be short.
Great. Hi, I'm Patty. We're the same class. I hope
Great.
this isn't a frivolous use of the last question. So I don't think we met. I don't think we ever danced at a Theta Del party or Splendor in the Grass.
Where were you freshman year?
Well, actually, I transferred.
Oh, okay. I was at Ujima. We did a lot of dancing.
Oh, you know one of my high school friends.
Okay.
But I'm curious, on Saturday night, were you debating the apartheid protests? And did you see this incredible future you had? You had a great body of work. Did you see where you're going then at 19 to now? Or what was the sliding glass door moment? What would you have done if you didn't take this impressive future?
Well, that's a big question. Can we go over 90 seconds or not? 90 seconds, okay. That's a great last question. So there was a lot of chance in my life. The most important, most fateful thing in my life, my junior year, at the beginning of the junior year in college here at Stanford, I was in line, and I just met this young woman earlier that day. It was like the first week of school, and she introduced me to her roommate. And that roommate of hers is now my wife. So that was the most important thing that ever happened to me at Stanford, meeting my wife, Donna Norton. So that was the first moment of chance. The second moment of chance, when I was a kid here at Stanford, I was a 17-year-old kid from Montana. I was, from a family of modest means. My father was a musician, country western musician. My mom, she would say she was a secretary. She's proud of that word. We now call them executive assistants at Montana State University. But I got here and I was freaked out by how much wealth there was here at Stanford. I just was overwhelmed. I could barely make it here. In our class, my parental contribution, just to give you a sense of where I came from, was $400, right? It wasn't because of my scholarship, because my SATs were 150 points below the average at Stanford. It was because I was poor. And I was pissed off about it, I want to tell you honestly. And I was a little radical about it. And when I hear people talk about the Soviet Union being so awful, and I was like, well, how do you know? You ever been there? I would say that to my professors. And that's why I wanted to go see this place. And so my first time abroad ever was to Leningrad in 1983. And even after that trip, I came back saying, well, yeah, they got some problems. Yeah, you got to stand in line for an hour and a half to get an ice cream cone. But it was white nights, and I was there with 100 other college kids from America. It was kind of fun. And this one beautiful gal, no, never mind. Irene was her name, from Princeton. We stood in line together. It was fun. But then, big two last moments I'm going to end with. I went back in 85. My Russian was better. It was the winter. My then girlfriend, now wife, was in Florence, because she's a lot more rational than I am, and having the time of her life. By the way, to call Italy at the time was $72 for a 6-minute call, so I had to work on the black market to call my girlfriend, and I would catch her like 50% of the time, because, oh, I'm sorry, I missed your call, we were out, buying shoes or whatever. But that, all joking aside, that's when I saw the Soviet dictatorship. I got more into society. I met Jewish refuseniks then who couldn't leave the country because they were Jewish. I met opposition-type people. I saw the incredible inequality between those that were members of the Communist Party and not. And I became a militant small d Democrat. And when I came back to Stanford, that's when I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, because I was against dictatorship in South Africa and the Soviet Union. And a through line of my academic work and my kind of values, and you saw some of these people I brought here. I brought them here. All those Democrats, I brought them here because we want to be part of this democratic movement. That all came from Stanford. Tremendous debt I have from being here as a kid. The wild card that I became an academic, I wasn't planning to be an academic. I was a Rhodes Scholar, and because I got a Rhodes Scholarship, that took me to Oxford and got me off of the path of, I was planning to go to law school and go work in Washington. And honestly, for many decades of my life, I wasn't sure that teaching at an elite place like this was a good use of my time. But in retrospect, now, celebrating my 40th reunion, I would say two things. One, I have been incredibly privileged to be able to work in government for a while and to interact with my ideas. I'm going to be on TV 3 or 4 times today, and to have that space. And so you can figure out, back to your question about what can individuals do, you can figure out, if you know what you believe in, and you know what you want to do, then you can figure out the jobs around that. I think too many of my students get that mixed up. They like to be, and then they get to the job and it's like, what do I want to do? So I feel very privileged that I'm able to do that from here. But the last thing I'll say, the longer I've been here, the more I feel so privileged to be at Stanford for a couple of reasons. One, our football team is going to get better, and I'm a big football fan, and I'm working with Andrew on that. And Brad Freeman of the Freeman Spogli Institute is also working with Andrew in much bigger ways than I am. I've had season tickets for 20 or 30 years. But the greatest thing about being here is that every day, 2 + 2 = 4. Not just on Tuesdays and Fridays. That you can't roll into a meeting and say, I think this, I believe that. Everything, well, that's your hypothesis. What's your data to support that? That is a really unique thing. That's not true in Washington. That's not true in Moscow. It's an incredible thing to be someplace where data matters, facts matters, and that's every day, just not every other day. And the last thing, and I'll end on this. This book I just wrote took me a minute. But no, this is about Stanford. This is about Stanford. I'm sorry. This book I just wrote is a class I've been teaching at Stanford for several years. And the privilege to be, the last class I taught in the spring, it was 50% undergraduates, 50% graduates, 50% students from the United States, 50% international, from all over the planet, Europe, Asia, Africa. What an incredible place it is to teach here. They think they're paying and they think I'm teaching them, but I've written many books here and I learn from my students. And so at this stage of my life, I cannot imagine a better place to be than Stanford University. And if you support our university, thank you. Thanks a lot.